Top 10 Haunted Places in Illinois. Congress Plaza Hotel, Chicago. Built in 1893 by R.H. Southgate and originally called the Auditorium Annex. Al Capone lived in the hotel and has never left. Apparitions of him have been seen roaming the halls and near his old suite on the 8th floor. Peg Leg Johnny is a hobo host that has the urge to turn room lights and electronics on and off. Dr. H. Holmes, America's first serial killer, was known to loiter in the hotel's lobby to find new victims. He was a psychopath that would take young women back to his murder castle to torture and kill them. The most haunted room in the hotel is room 441. The female ghost that occupies that room likes to kick guests away from the end of the bed. It is also the most requested room of the hotel. John Michael Langer's ghost likes to rearrange furniture and be mischievous. The ghost boy's mother was an immigrant, and she was so distraught enough over this that she threw her 2 children out of one of the hotel windows. She followed the 2 children immediately. Unfortunately, they were all found dead on the pavement below. Manteno State Hospital, Manteno. It opened in 1930 and formerly known as the Manteno State Mental Hospital. The typhoid fever epidemic swept through the halls of the hospital and killed over 50 employees and patients. Staff shortages due to budget cuts in World War II caused abuse and neglect of the patients. Patients were often led to fend for themselves. Stories of patients attacking their caregivers were often reported. Government doctors came to the hospital sometime in 1936 and began experiments on the patients to try to help cure their mental illness and attempt at curing malaria. The first experiments were electroshock. The second experiment was unknowingly injecting patients with malaria. In the 1940s, these doctors started giving the patients lobotomies. Lobotomy is a procedure where a hole is drilled into the front of the skull in an attempt to modify behavior. They were leaving patients with severe brain damage. Many of the patients were left in a vegetable state, unable to function, while the ones who were left with the ability to move were emotionally blank. The majority of the patients who had this procedure done died late due to complications. Over 400 patients died from these experiments. In 1941, reports of escaped patients skyrocketed, with almost 200 patients escaping that year alone. Reports of sexual abuse were also made public. The hospital shut down in 1985 and eventually became business rentals, a bank, and even private residences. There have been reports of shadow people, disembodied voices, feelings of being watched, apparitions of patients and nurses, ghostly voices coming from the non-functional intercom system, and cold hands pulling on clothing. Ashmore Estates, Ashmore. It was built in 1916 and was a poor house, allowing many to work for their room and board. It was sold by the county in 1959 and opened as a private psychiatric facility. In October 1964, the facility closed due to debt. It reopened in 1965, but instead of being a private facility, it took patients from state mental institutions. The building desperately needed to be expanded due to overcrowding, but the money would not be appropriated until 1977. In 1989, an attempt was made to reopen the Ashmore Estates as a mental health facility for teenage boys, but the Ashmore Village Board denied the request because of fire safety issues and opposition from the townsfolk. In 1998, the house was sold to a man from Sullivan, Illinois. He attempted to remodel it into a home, but continuous vandalism and break-ins forced him to stop. In 2006, Ashmore Estates was purchased by a private owner. Tornado damage and other setbacks forced the sale of the building to the new owner, who opened it up for paranormal investigations. There have been reports of apparitions, phantom footsteps, EVPs, shadow movements, and unexplained sounds. McPike Mansion, Alton. Henry Guest McPike commissioned a local architect to build his mansion in 1869. McPike died due to a brief illness in his home in 1945. Sharon and George Lukey bought the home in 1994 to renovate it. They believe many spirits roam the McPike Mansion. Lydia, Henry's mother, is one. Her precedence is pretty strong and she likes to be introduced to anyone new who enters the house. Mary, Henry's first wife, is kind of shy but in a good spirit. Jameson, Henry's son and daughter-in-law. Jenny also like to be known. Jenny is the trickster. She likes to touch people by pulling on people's hair lightly or touching their ear. The Rialto Square Theater, Joliet. It opened on May 24, 1926, and moviegoers paid 50 cents to see the silent film, Mademoiselle Modiste. A nameless apparition of a woman who is said to be in her 20s, very pretty, and surrounded by a hazy light has been reported floating around. It's believed she was an actress that performed in the theater years ago. Male and female spirits are sometimes spotted on the balcony. It's rumored the couple fell to their deaths from the balcony. Sudden coldness, strange noises, objects moving on their own, and feelings of being jabbed by an unseen finger have been reported. Couch Mausoleum in Lincoln Park, Chicago. At the end of the 1960s, the cemetery was to become the parkland. The relatives of the deceased were responsible for transplanting the corpses somewhere else. At the edge of the cemetery stood a big mausoleum with the name Couch on it. It withstood the Great Chicago Fire. The tomb was built by businessman Ira Couch in the 1800s. Couch died in 1875. There are reports of shadow figures moving around the tomb and whispering. Site of the Eastland River disaster, Chicago River. On July 25, 1915, the SS Eastland steamship capsized, trapping 2,572 passengers on board. 844 passengers and crew died due to heavy furniture, crushing and drowning them from being trapped. Many Chicago stores were used as makeshift morgues to store the recovered bodies. Feelings of unease, seeing apparitions, and unusual wave patterns reported. H. Holmes Murder Castle Site, Chicago. H. Holmes was born Herman Webster Mudgett. He attended medical school at the University of Michigan. Holmes would steal cadavers and he would disfigure or burn them. He would take out insurance policies on the deceased people in question and collect the money. He moved to Chicago around 1885 and began working at a pharmacy under the name Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Holmes took over the pharmacy and had the murder castle constructed across the road. He fired and hired many construction crews over the time it took to build the hotel so he could hide the intentions of the hotel. The hotel was originally 2 stories high with storefronts and a drugstore on the first floor and apartments above. Holmes added a 3rd floor. Once completed, Holmes put out ads in the paper for jobs for young women, as well as advertising the hotel as a place to stay. All hotel employees had to take out life insurance policies on themselves that had Holmes listed as the sole beneficiary. Holmes paid the premiums. The rooms of the hotel could only be locked from the outside and the controls for the gas lamps were located outside so that Holmes could turn on the gas and asphyxiate people at will. It also had doors and stairways that went nowhere, hidden and closed rooms, parts of the walls moved, and chutes that led to the cellar. The cellar had operating tables, a crematory, pits containing quicklime and acids, surgical instruments, and various torture racks. The location where Holmes Murder Castle stood is now a post office. It is rumored that part of the post office basement is from the original hotel building. There are reports of seeing shadow figures, disembodied voices, footsteps, and hearing screams when walking past the post office. Peoria State Hospital Bowen Building, Bartonville. Construction of the original building began in 1885 and was completed in 1887. It was never used due to structural and design flaws and torn down in 1897. The building was built over an old coal mine and the decay was believed to be because of the collapsing of the old mine. It reopened in 1902, led by Dr. George A. Zeller. There were 33 different buildings that were used to house patients, a nurse's home, a store, a powerhouse, and a domestic building with laundry, a bakery and kitchen. Dr. Zeller implemented a system for burying the patients that die under the care of the facility. The facility would bury the patients that were unclaimed in the cemeteries that were located behind the main building. The bodies of the patients that were claimed would be shipped to their kin. The older headstones on the grounds were just labeled with patient numbers. Many patients came to the hospital without names. The newer headstones had the names, date of birth, and date of death on them. The first reported ghost encounter happened in the cemetery and was reported by Dr. Zeller. Dr. Zeller created a burial corp enlisted in helping bury the bodies of the patients who died. It consisted of 1 staff member and about 6 competent patients. A bookbinder was a gravedigger that Dr. Zeller described as strong and healthy. A bookbinder worked at a printing house and suffered a breakdown that left him mute. When he was arrested, the officer wrote down his employment as a bookbinder, and a court clerk listed his name as a bookbinder, and he was sent to the hospital that way. Staff quickly enlisted him to help with the funeral, and staff nicknamed him Old Book. The hospital held funerals for the patients out of respect for them, but most were strangers to the staff. When the coffin was being lowered, the gravediggers would stand back, out of the way, and wait quietly for the funeral to end. When it was over, the gravediggers would set to filling the grave. The first funeral Old Book removed his cap, wiped his eyes, and began to weep loudly. At every service after, he would use his sleeve to wipe his tears and walk over to the graveyard elm, the giant elm that stood in the center of the cemetery. Old Book eventually passed away. Word spread he passed, and 100 nurses and 300 staff and patients attended his funeral. Dr. Zeller led his service. Old Book's casket was placed on 2 crossbeams above his empty graveside, and 4 men stood aside to lower him. When it was time for him to be lowered into the ground, the men grasped the ropes, stooped forward, and with all of their strength, prepared to lift the coffin to move the beams. The men heaved the ropes, and the coffin sprang into the air as if it were an empty eggshell. Dr. Zeller. The spectators were shocked, and the nurses shrieked. Half of them ran away, and the other half came up for a closer look. Among the commotion, a wailing voice was heard, and every eye turned toward the graveyard elm. Every man and woman stood staring, where they all saw Old Book weeping and moaning louder and harder than he had ever done. A few moments passed, and Dr. Zeller ordered a few men to open the casket, convinced Old Book was no longer inside. The moment the lid was lifted, the wailing stopped, and inside the coffin lay an unquestionably dead Old Book. A few days after the service, the graveyard elm began to wither and die. Every effort to save it was fruitless. The tree began to decline over the next year and was dead. After the last limb fell, Dr. Zeller ordered the tree to be chopped down. After the first swing of the axe, the workers stopped. They told Zeller they heard an agonizing, despairing cry of pain coming from the tree. Zeller suggests they burn it. They put the flames out as soon as it reaches the base because they heard a sobbing and crying sound coming for it. The facility ran after the death of Dr. Zeller. It added buildings, patients, and care facilities for children and tuberculosis patients. The facility was closed in 1972, and in 1980 the building was auctioned off to anyone who would tear it down, but it was returned to the bank after the buyer declared bankruptcy. The buildings are currently owned by Winsley Duran Jr. He hopes to restore the buildings and turn them into office spaces. There have been reports of apparitions, strange energy and voices. Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, Midlothian. Opened in 1883 and is owned by the cemetery trustees of the Cook County Board. The cemetery was a hotspot for local teens to party in a lover's lane. With it becoming popular, there was lots of vandalism, attempts at grave robbing, and evidence of satanic rituals. Many of the headstones were maliciously broken, defaced, spray painted, and stolen. The paranormal activity stories date back to the 1950s. It's a blue light that travels within the cemetery. It grows to the size of a basketball and blinks for 10 to 20 seconds and rapidly moves locations on the old Midlothian Turnpike, as well as moving along the gravestones. There have been reports of seeing it during the day and night. The light will disappear when investigators go to see it. In 1963, 3 young boys got lost in the woods, and after a couple of weeks they were found. All the boys could talk about was a blue light. In the fall of 1963, 5 men were standing on the north end of the pond. They all report seeing a blue light flying over the pond and chasing them. Scared, the men took off, got in their car and hightailed it down 143rd Street. They looked back only to see this light chasing them in the car. Distracted, they drove off the road into a cornfield, which caused the engine to stop. All 5 men saw the light floating around the car 3 times, and then it took off across the cornfield and disappeared into the forest. In 1971, Denise Travis said she saw the blue light when on a trip with her father. Denise said she out her hand through the light but did not feel any change in temperature or anything else out of the ordinary. Legend tells of an old house that resides near the cemetery. It is the home of the caretaker of the cemetery. The caretaker went crazy and murdered his family and took his own life in the house. The house mysteriously caught fire and burned down with all of them inside. 2 teenagers came to the cemetery to see if they could find the blue light in the disappearing house. The boys were walking the narrow path between the pond and creek where they came upon an angry man in his 70s and carrying an oil lamp illuminating a yellow glow. The man was yelling at the boys to leave. The boys got the man to calm down, and they explained they were there to find the house and the light. This angered man, and he explained there is no light and the house is still there because it's the caretaker's house and he is the caretaker. He tells the teens to go look for themselves and points in the direction they need to go. They head that way with the caretaker behind them. They notice the light of the lamp is gone and they turn around to investigate. The caretaker vanished. This ghost is regularly seen throughout the cemetery. The legend is that a farmer and his horse were plowing the land when the horse became spooked and ran into their pond, resulting in their death. A pair of park rangers were driving east on 143rd Street when they saw an apparition of a farmer and his horse cross the road. Just as quickly as they appeared, they were gone. The house in question is a small white 2-story house with a porch. Visitors to the cemetery report seeing the house on one visit and then it is gone the next. Or a person sees the house, only to be told that no house is there. An apparition of a woman in a white dress reported wandering aimlessly through the cemetery. On moonlit nights, you can see her holding a baby. 2 young men were visiting the cemetery. One walking around saw strange flickering lights within the cemetery. When turning around, he saw the rear end of a black dog fading away into nothingness. The phantom dog is believed to be a black Doberman. There are reports of the dog being spotted walking out of the roped entrance to the path leading to the cemetery. The summer of 1984, Norman Basile, paranormal investigator in Chicago, and an associate of his were visiting the cemetery for an overnight investigation. His associate saw a yellow apparition by the trees, and a few moments after that, they both saw red streaking lights and a single tree shaking frantically. The apparition that was seen that night was of the yellow man. He is a yellow figure with a hat, believed to be in his 40s. The picture is one taken by Norman Basile. Al Capone killed and dumped many bodies in the nearby pond. It was a favorite of his dumping ground.